got a lot of nostalgia for the original Prince of Persia trilogy. I spent hours playing them on my PS2 as a kid, then replaying them on my PSP during family trips, and they've stuck with me ever since. Each game in the trilogy is distinct and genuinely fantastic. There's tight platforming, smart level design, memorable set pieces, and a story that ties everything together with real intent. What made them special though was how each entry built on the last. They kept the core experience familiar, but each one brought something new, whether that was a shift in tone, mechanics, or style. It's rare to see a series take that kind of creative risk across 3 games and still land on its feet. The Sands of Time had an almost fairy tale charm, full of wonder and innocence. After it underperformed commercially, Ubisoft aimed to broaden the series' appeal by adopting a tougher, more aggressive tone, mostly influenced by popular action games of the time like God of War and Devil May Cry. The result was Warrior Within, a much darker and grittier tale, filled with brutal combat, heavier themes, and a protagonist who was no longer the hopeful, innocent prince, but a hardened, brooding figure haunted by fate. This shift divided fans as some embraced the edgier direction and deeper gameplay mechanics, while others missed the original's charm and storytelling style. Despite the mixed reactions though, Warrior Within succeeded in carving out its own identity and expanding the franchise's audience, even if it meant sacrificing some of the lightness that made the first game so memorable. And personally, in hindsight, I think it was the right move for the series.
You cannot change your fate. No man can.
Following Warrior Within, the Two Thrones sought to find a middle ground between the series' contrasting tones. It merged the dark, intense combat and atmosphere of Warrior Within with the more thoughtful storytelling and emotional depth of Sands of Time. To bring back that sense of nostalgia, Yuri Lowenthal returned to voice the prince, replacing Robin Atkin Downes, who had reflected the previous game's darker shift. The Two Thrones also introduced the compelling duality of the prince and his darker alter ego, the Dark Prince, adding new layers of complexity both in narrative and gameplay. With refined mechanics that balanced fast-paced action and stealth, the game felt like a proper evolution, a fitting conclusion that acknowledged the prince's turbulent journey through anger and redemption. While it didn't quite recapture the pure magic of the original, it successfully tied the trilogy together with a sense of closure and growth, proving that the series could evolve without losing its soul. What's even more remarkable though, is that they managed to release each game just 1 year after the previous one. Considering the ambitious changes in tone, gameplay and storytelling between each title, pulling off such a tight development timeline is impressive. Usually, big shifts like these take much longer to execute well, but Ubisoft's team pushed boundaries and adapted quickly, showing real dedication to evolving the series without long gaps. That pace likely contributed to some rough edges, but it also kept the momentum alive and fans engaged through a continuous unfolding journey. Since then, however, it feels like Ubisoft has struggled to find a clear direction for the Prince of Persia franchise. In 2008, they attempted a bold reboot with a cel-shaded art style, a new prince, and Nolan North lending his voice. This was a complete departure from the original trilogy, a fresh universe with an entirely new story that aimed to reinvent the series for a modern audience. But the gamble didn't pay off. The game failed to resonate with long-time fans or attract a substantial new player base, and commercially, it fell short of expectations. Afterwards, in an attempt to revitalise the franchise, Ubisoft began pushing the Prince of Persia brand into mainstream pop culture with the release of the 2010 Jake Gyllenhaal movie Prince of Persia: The Sands of Time. While the film brought some new attention to the franchise, it received mixed reviews, but more importantly, it struggled to capture the magic of the original game. Which is what Ubisoft attempted to do with The Forgotten Sands, a new video game entry that aimed to fit into the timeline between Sands of Time and Warrior Within. It was an attempt to return to the series' roots whilst capitalising on nostalgia and to correct the missteps of the 2008 game. Yuri Lowenthal returned to voice the prince, and the game brought back the classic signature acrobatics and also introduced elemental powers to freshen up the gameplay. However, one of the most controversial aspects was the prince's new face model. It feels strangely off, almost as if the design was hastily cobbled together and then neglected, lacking the polish it desperately needed. It doesn't resemble the original Prince in the slightest, and generally just comes across as awkward and off-putting. I'm not sure what went wrong during character design, but the Prince here looks like a strange mix between a plastic doll and a Neanderthal. Fans online have compared him to Cornelius from Planet of the Apes, while others joked that he looks like someone crossbred Jake Gyllenhaal with a character from Thunderbirds. Although the developers seem to aim for a blend of his Sands of Time and Warrior Within appearances, the final design resembles neither. The result is a jarring redesign that overshadowed the game's positive elements and became the main topic of discussion before release. While Forgotten Sands tried to strike a balance between nostalgia and innovation, the awkward new face paired with a safe story and gameplay left the game feeling like a missed chance to truly evolve the franchise. Even though it is solid and enjoyable at times, it lacked the emotional depth and bold creativity that originally defined the series. Ultimately, it felt like a movie tie-in game, despite not technically being one, and the result was a buggy, repetitive and awkwardly paced experience that failed to fully capitalize on its limited strengths.
My disappointment is immeasurable, and my day is ruined.
The game begins as the prince returns to his homeland after hearing that his kingdom is under siege. Upon arrival, he discovers that his brother, Malik, has taken command in his absence and is desperately trying to defend their people from a massive invading army. In a bid to protect the kingdom, Malik taps into ancient elemental powers, unleashing a supernatural sand army, granting Malik immense strength and the ability to conjure devastating forces against their enemies. However, he then uses this power, which quickly becomes unstable, and the magic spirals out of control, threatening to consume the kingdom itself. Unaware of the full extent of his brother's actions, the prince then sets out to understand the source of this elemental magic and seeks to find a way to contain it before it destroys everything they are trying to save. The story unfolds at a steady pace initially, but unfortunately it becomes boring and tedious for a large chunk in the middle, before picking up again in the final hour. Dialogue is pretty basic, as it's mostly exposition with the prince and his brother exchanging orders rather than showing any real insight into their relationship.
I think the levers behind you lock the mechanism. If you unlock it, that should let you raise the bridge.
There's no real payoff either. The ending is abrupt and laughable. It just cuts to credits and tries to tie up loose ends, but it feels ultimately unsatisfying.
Malik!
Gameplay-wise, it's a third-person platformer with light combat elements very similar to previous entries in the series. The signature rewind mechanic returns, which is always fun and adds a nice safety net for the puzzles and platforming. Movement animations are excellent and add to the enjoyment of pulling off moves like wall running, swinging on poles, sliding down flag banners, turning cranks, and jumping between gaps. Unfortunately though, the game has a bit of input lag, which spoils the enjoyment of these moments. The water manipulation mechanic is by far the best part of the game. It adds clever complexity to the platforming, although the overall challenge remains quite easy and forgiving, especially when combined with the rewind feature. Another mechanic, which involves elements of time travel and allows you to alter the environment as you progress, adds further depth. Unfortunately, these two mechanics are rarely used together and mostly appear separately, which feels like a missed opportunity. Using them in tandem could have introduced more variety and player agency, encouraging thoughtful engagement instead of just going through the motions. However, even though they aren't used to their full potential, without them, the game would be terrible. They carry this game hard. The level design includes classic set pieces and environmental destruction that ties into the traversal, but there are too few of these moments that keep things consistently exciting. The camera is generally quite good, showing you the path forward and often panning across puzzle rooms to show you the route that you need to take, which is a nice throwback to the older titles. Quality of life improvements like autosave and the ability to skip cutscenes are also welcome, especially for anyone who wants to speedrun. The game runs around 4 hours with a new Game Plus option letting you carry all your upgrades and XP into another playthrough, offering some replayability. However, combat is where the game really falls flat. It's extremely bland, repetitive, and feels like a total slog. Enemy attack patterns are boring, and none of the new enemies feel any different from one another. They're basically damage sponges to button mash against, and it doesn't help when the sword feels weightless, like you're waving a feather around with no real impact or feedback. The combat encounters towards the later stages become padding, throwing wave after wave of enemies and copy and paste mini bosses that all follow the same predictable routine. Eventually, I just found myself running and jumping past encounters to ignore and bypass enemies that were in the way. There's also a skill tree that's introduced in Forgotten Sands, but to be honest, it's a bit of a letdown. While you do unlock a fair range of abilities and upgrades at a decent pace, none of them really shake up the gameplay in any meaningful way. The improvements just don't feel satisfying or impactful. The only satisfying thing about the skill tree is when a certain random soundbite plays when you unlock a new ability. In general though, combat just remains repetitive and dull, and the skills don't encourage you to think or strategize, they're just there. You can pretty much just spam attacks without any real consequence, which makes progression feel shallow. It's another missed opportunity to add depth and variety to the experience. The AI is downright brainless. In combat, enemies walk around in slow motion, telegraphing their attacks well in advance. When it comes to traversal, they're nothing more than obstacles you barely have to think about, just a barrier blocking the path to the next area. During my playthrough, I ran into a few bugs. At one point, the level behind me vanished and I fell through the floor, and an open balcony door acted like an invisible wall, blocking my path. These glitches, combined with the abrupt ending I mentioned earlier, give the whole game a rushed, half-hearted feel, which is a far cry from the care and polish of the original trilogy. I've got to say though, the art direction, voice acting, and pre-rendered cutscenes still hold up remarkably well 15 years later. The game perfectly captures the atmosphere it aims for, and the palace's diverse locations, from the gardens and stables to the ruins, dungeons and prisons, are all distinct and enjoyable to explore. While the gameplay can get repetitive at times, the environmental detail remains impressive overall. The game definitely has its own unique style and it stands out visually, so it's aged pretty well here. The soundtrack is also excellent, featuring memorable themes that complement the game beautifully, enhancing both immersion and the excitement of the platforming sections. Overall, The Forgotten Sands is a solid but flawed entry to the series. It tries to bridge old and new, but the awkward character redesign, repetitive combat and lackluster story hold it back from being a true return to form. That said, the platforming, level design and soundtrack are strong enough to keep fans engaged, even if just for a few hours. There are a few memorable moments, but they're too few and far between to leave a lasting impact. It's a decent experience that was overlooked, but I'm not sure if I'd call it underrated or worth going out of your way to play. If you're a fan of the series and you've played the original games, then sure, this one's worth a go. But if you want the real Prince of Persia experience, go back to the original trilogy. Those games are masterpieces, each with their own unique charm, and they still hold up pretty well today. And who knows, with Ubisoft currently working on the Sands of Time remake, maybe they're finally on the path to recapturing that original magic in a modern game. Until then, The Forgotten Sands serves as a bittersweet reminder of what was and what could have been.